In this program, we are going to explore the role of patients and organizations like the Lupus Foundation of America in developing new treatments, particularly for lupus. To help us understand this process, I'd like to bring in Dr. Victoria Werth. Dr. Werth is a professor of dermatology and medicine at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, and she is chief of the Division of Dermatology at the Philadelphia Veterans Administration Hospital in Philadelphia. Dr. Werth, thank you very much for taking time to speak with us today.
My pleasure.
Briefly, to begin our program, let's briefly talk about the steps that are involved in conducting clinical trials of a potential new therapy. I understand that there are a number of phases or steps that are involved. Can you just briefly outline those for us?
Absolutely. Any drug that has the potential to come to market has to go through a fairly strict process of approval. And the initial phase 1 study is really just looking if what the drug is safe in a small number of either healthy people using established dosing, and really is all about safety. Often this will involve a single dose of the drug followed by multiple doses, and only after safety is established in these phase 1 studies, as well as not seeing any untoward effects, that one would progress on to a phase 2 study, which is looking at the drug's effectiveness in patients and monitoring safety. These tend to be smaller studies than, for instance, a phase 3 study. The phase 2 is really looking for a signal as to whether or not the drug may in fact be effective when it's tested in a phase 3 much larger study. The phase 3 studies are often much more international, many more patients, and they're randomized double-blinded trial designs, which allow differentiating people who get the active therapeutic drug versus placebo. Often phase 2 trials are also randomized, but it's just that the phase 3 is much larger and has a better chance of looking at both effectiveness as well as safety.
For the phase 3 trials, well, actually for the phase 2 trials as well, I assume that they need people with lupus to participate in these trials of potential lupus therapies. Is that correct?
Yes. Lupus is, although it's not an orphan disease, is not that common, and in the sense of trying to do these larger trials. And it's really important that we get better therapies for lupus. We still don't have as many treatments as we would like to have. And therefore, participation when these trials may involve hundreds of lupus patients really is important. It's really impossible to get new treatments to market and evaluated properly to get to market without people really stepping up and being willing to be part of these studies.
So volunteering for a study is pretty important if we really want to get more therapies specifically for lupus. That we need volunteers who have the disease and to want to be willing to participate. What questions should these potential volunteers ask before they decide whether or not they might want to proceed with participation? And if they are interested, what are the steps? How do they get started?
Right. Well, there are a number of ways to get started. One is to identify where the studies are being conducted, or to talk to one's physician about maybe the interest in doing a study, and seeing if there are places that are geographically relatively nearby that you might be able to hear more about the trials. And there are lots of questions to ask, and one of them is to make sure that you ask a lot of questions about the design of the study in terms of how many patients, how many arms, what's the chances of getting the drug, is there a chance that after the trial you'll actually get to get the drug, even if during the trial itself, during the first part of the trial, perhaps you got placebo, are you going to benefit by volunteering? And that can be a motivator to be part of a study. So there are really a number of questions that way. What is the safety record? What are the initial phase 1 or 2 parts of the studies shown? What's the rationale? Why do you think this might be a good treatment for lupus? And so just asking questions to make sure you're comfortable, and make sure that the site where you're visiting potentially that might be able to recruit you to a study, make sure that they really can answer your questions and take your questions seriously, because that's really an important partnership in terms of being part of a trial.
I would think also that it's very important to talk this over with the doctor who is managing your lupus specifically, so that they may be aware of certain reasons why it would not recommend participation in that particular trial by that individual.
Yeah, many of the trials are really geared at maybe a particular subset of patient, and you want to make sure that you're going to fit the criteria before you even start thinking about a study. And each study is a little bit different in terms of what they're looking for, in terms of what organs are involved, the level of severity, the background medications that you might already be on. And these are all things that an expert in lupus is going to be able to discuss with you and make sense about in terms of whether this particular study would be the correct study for you.
Let's talk a little bit about how the Lupus Foundation of America and its industry partners work together to be able to improve the way clinical trials are conducted. I know that we've had a number of clinical trials over the years where the results didn't meet expectations, and we've been working to improve the chances of a successful outcome. Can you talk a little bit about the ways that the LFA and industry are working together?
Yes. Well, I think industry is able to identify where some of the gaps are and trying to develop studies, and many of them relate to the design of the trial, being able to talk to organizations like the FDA to make sure that the trial design will be effective, and being able to see improvement and changes, knowing is a reasonable outcome depending on what type of lupus a person has. And so there's a lot of studies that have to be done to develop the correct tools and also the correct approach to doing studies. So the Lupus Foundation helped bring experts together to look at the problems that have happened with some of the lupus trials. What are some of the issues that we've had with problems with high placebo response rates, so that we can't show that a drug is working? And the experts came together again with the help of the Lupus Foundation, organizing this with the industry partners that are really interested in figuring out how to do lupus trials in a successful way that will benefit patients. And so the groups came together, and we actually wrote a white paper that talked about how to improve things like trial designs, what kind of outcomes to measure. And it was really a white paper that was written in response to a request by the FDA to help them understand how better to design these lupus trials. More recently, there have been some efforts to try to increase access of patients who have skin manifestations of lupus into trials as well. And this has required a different approach because there's a need to recognize what the problems are with cutaneous lupus, what are the problems for the patients, and what are the questions when you have more than one subset of skin lupus, and how do you develop an outcome measure that can actually help advance treatments in the field. And again, the LFA stepped in and organized industry partners that are trying to go, for instance, from phase 2 to phase 3 trials, and really need to set up a dialogue about how best to do this with the FDA, using an educational component for that. And that has been a great process that has really brought people together, and I think the Lupus Foundation has done a great job in helping with this.
Yeah, and it's a key, important part of the Foundation's research effort to be able to address these barriers that in the past have stood in the way of getting approvals from the FDA on potential medications. So it's a great partnership, not only between the LFA and industry, but also from researchers and clinicians like yourself who are developing and assisting in developing these instruments and tools and all the different ways, and making recommendations for how these trials should be conducted. Well, speaking of trials, there have been a number of trials that have been either are in process or have been recently completed that are generating a lot of interest right now in the field. Can you just highlight some of those and where they stand and what are the potential for these therapies? What do they mean? What potential do they hold for people who have lupus?
So I think this is an incredibly exciting time because we know a lot more about ways to modify the immune system that are relevant to lupus. There are a lot of ways that are being evaluated by drug companies. And I would say that there's been a number now recently of successful phase 2 trials that are really going to go on to phase 3 and potentially change the way that we can approach treatment. What's exciting is that there have been some recent phase 3 trials that have really been quite successful and will even more quickly, I think, bring new drugs hopefully to market. There have been 3 phase 3 trials, and the 3 drugs are still being evaluated in terms of whether they'll be approved or not. But one of them is already approved, which is belimumab, and that's approved for patients who have SLE and have autoantibodies. But the more recent trial was actually looking at people who had lupus nephritis, and it was looking at whether or not there was improvement in renal function and in proteinuria. And the response was better in the treatment group relative to the placebo, and again, providing a very exciting potential alternative approach or additional therapy to the current regimen. I will mention that in the context of a trial, you have to treat the people who get placebo. So the background drugs are not stopped. You have to allow people to be treated so that their disease will not progress. So it's not so easy to tell the difference between the effect of a drug and the effect of the background therapy. But they were able to show that there was a difference, and therefore, that may expand the indication for treatment to lupus nephritis. There was also a recent study of a drug called voclosporin that was also a positive study. And there's definitely been use of these calcineurin inhibitors for a number of years, but they have had lots of problems in terms of side effects. And in this particular study, they looked at lupus nephritis, and were able to show that the side effects are less than what we have seen with other inhibitors in the past, and also that it was a successful trial in terms of decreasing the amount of protein in the urine. And so again, another drug for lupus nephritis that really has not been available before, and hopefully will be something that can be used in the future. Lastly, there was a phase 3 trial for anifrolumab that was successful, and that's also extremely exciting because that's a drug that we know has effects on the type 1 interferons, which we know are important in the pathogenesis of SLE, and we know that the antibody has a way to block the effects of the interferons, and they were able to show that SLE measures improved in the patients who got anifrolumab relative to the placebo. So a third potential therapy for patients with SLE. And so again, I think it speaks to the importance of the studies, the idea that we're learning better how to design trials and how to think about outcomes, and it bodes very well for the future for patients with lupus that there will be new treatments coming to market.
That's certainly very exciting news and very promising developments in the field after waiting for so long for additional therapies for lupus. This is really great news, and I want to thank you for taking time today to speak with us. We've been speaking to Dr. Victoria Werth. She is a professor of dermatology and medicine at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine and chief of the Division of Dermatology at the Philadelphia Veterans Administration. I might also add that she is a longtime member of the Lupus Foundation of America Medical Scientific Advisory Council, the group that consists of many different medical specialties who are experts in lupus and advising the foundation on policies and directions in research. And we really appreciate not only the work that Dr. Werth is doing, but all of the other medical experts in lupus who are adding to the knowledge base about the disease and helping guide the future for new treatments for lupus. Dr. Werth, thank you again for taking time to speak with us today.
My pleasure. Good talking to you.